Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. We will be beginning very shortly. Just a couple quick reminders before we begin. Please silence all cell phones, and during the Q&A portion of the event, please wait for the mic to come to you. Stand, state your name and affiliation before you ask your brief question. Thank you.
Project shows that students of color, students with disabilities, and students from other historically underserved populations represent a disproportionate number of these young people. Black students are suspended and expelled at more than 3 times the rate of white students, while students with disabilities are more than twice as likely to receive an out-of-school suspension than those without disabilities. In 2014, the Obama administration took action to help close these disparities. It issued guidance that cautioned schools against disproportionate rates of student discipline, provided resources to help improve their policies, and lifted up examples of alternative policies that can build more positive and inclusive climates in our schools. Now, with the support of conservative advocates, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has signaled her intent to rescind this guidance. If the department follows such a path, it will choose to ignore the overwhelming evidence of the academic community and turn its back on our nation's duty to protect the civil rights of all students. What's more, Rescinding the guidance would show, once again, that this administration simply does not care about people of color. Sadly, that blatant disregard is on full display in these last weeks, as the president and his allies may shut down the government instead of protecting nearly 800,000 dreamers, a group that actually includes 20,000 undocumented teachers. So it will take all of us, from advocates in the education community to members of Congress, to tell Secretary DeVos and the rest of the Trump administration to stand up for the rights of every young person in our country. I'd like to thank all of the inspiring panelists who will take the stage in a few moments. And now I'm excited to welcome a leader with a long history of protecting students from discrimination and fighting to make sure that all students can learn in a safe and supportive environment. As a member of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Chris Murphy has worked tirelessly to protect the guidance we'll talk about today. Senator Murphy has also co-authored the Support of School Climate Act of 2015, which requires schools to show how they will develop positive behavior interventions for students that can dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And he's amended the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to ensure that states develop policies that stop unnecessary seclusion and physical restraints. Senator Murphy has recently co-authored a letter to Betsy DeVos asking her to maintain the Obama administration's guidelines on school discipline. He has led on so many issues, and his voice is so critical to our debates now, actually more than ever, from reducing gun violence to national security to health care for all Americans to our economy. Senator Murphy is a leader. We are honored that he could join us to talk about his continued commitment to expanding opportunity on behalf of all children. So please join me in welcoming Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut.
Well, thank you very much, Winnie. Thank you to Cap and to all of our fantastic panelists who are here today. Really wonderful to join you again to talk about some really important work that we have ahead of us with respect to making sure that every child in this country gets a quality, affordable, and equal education. Winnie is right. This is an issue that I've spent much of my career working on, dating back to my time in the Connecticut State Legislature. And I'm here today because, as Winnie noted, we are at risk of throwing away a truly historic opportunity, an opportunity to make amends for one of the most perverse, unintentional legacies of the No Child Left Behind era, the perpetuation of this thing we have come to call the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, you're here today, I assume, because you already know what that is. No Child Left Behind, it had a lot of good parts to it, despite its fairly bad reputation across the country. It held schools strictly accountable for educating every single child inside their walls. And so, over time, schools figured out ways to try to get around that requirement. And one way that schools figured out how to get around that requirement was to get rid of students who were a little bit harder to teach, thus not continuing the responsibility to test them and to be held accountable for them. So reprimands led to suspensions, which led to expulsions, which led to dropouts. Other kids, frankly, just got arrested and kicked out of school for conduct that used to be taken care of in the principal's office. Now, most schools weren't malevolent about this. They had straight-faced justifications for tough discipline, and discipline has always been and will always be a part of how schools create climates that are right for learning. And of course, this was happening before No Child Left Behind as well. No Child Left Behind didn't create the school-to-prison pipeline. But NCLB did provide an excuse and an incentive structure to push out kids who really did nothing that would justify their losing access to a quality, equal education. And the data that we got, the data that we could get, because there wasn't a lot of it detailing this phenomenon, was truly damning. Winnie mentioned some of it. Black students were getting suspended and expelled at a rate that was not twice as high as white students, it was 3 times as high as white students. Disabled kids were getting out of school suspensions at a rate that was twice that of non-disabled students. And the suspensions and expulsions that were happening all across the country, they weren't making schools any safer. Now, take my state of Connecticut, one of the few states that actually has developed pretty good data over the years on the details of this epidemic. In my state, kids weren't getting suspended for truly violent or threatening behavior. They were getting suspended for relatively benign violations of school policy, like talking back to a teacher or skipping class. Over 60% of suspensions and expulsions in Connecticut fit this category, simple violations of school policy. And I bet you that those statistics in Connecticut are mirrored, if not worse, in other parts of the country. Now, my wife, as some of you know, she spent 10 years representing low-income students in school discipline cases in Connecticut. She's now here in Washington helping states build better school climates. But her successor in Connecticut shared with me a fairly recent typical case that she is working on. She explained, I'm currently working on a case with a middle schooler who has ADHD and a history of very serious trauma resulting from a home invasion. This is a child who can't sit still in a classroom. He gets up constantly, and he will go out into the classroom and run through the hallways. His mom is consistently getting calls to pick him up in school because the school doesn't know what to do with him. He's getting suspended for minor things like talking back. Other times they won't suspend him. They'll just call his mother and ask her to take him out of school. Now, this simple case, it represents a whole bunch of wrongs, but there are 2 really grave ones that overdiscipline creates. First, this student isn't getting any help for his disability or for his trauma. The discipline is simply just compounding it. And as a society, we have an obligation to educate every child, not just those that come to school free of trauma or learning challenges. Second, by pushing this student out, the school is sending a message to him that he doesn't belong, creating a downward spiral for him, but importantly, also for the school. Study after study tells us that positive school climates that are so integral to kids being successful, wanting to come to school, and thriving educationally, positive school climates are created when every child is made to feel like they have a place there. Pushing some kids out creates a punitive us versus them climate that affects not just the kids who are pushed out, but the whole school. Okay, so now the good news. The good news is that the Every Student Succeeds Act gives us a real chance to right this wrong. By requiring that states build comprehensive measurements of school performance, with factors other than test scores contributing to the evaluation of schools, the pressure is lessened a little bit to push out kids who take a little bit more effort to educate. Even better, states can make school climate and discipline rates an element of school evaluation, creating an incentive to keep kids in school instead of creating an incentive to push them out. Now, I authored the section of the new elementary and secondary education law that requires school climate and school discipline rates to be included in school report cards. And I'm glad that some states are already building ESSA plans that incentivize schools to do better on school discipline. But as you're here today, and as Winnie previewed, Secretary DeVos is contemplating taking a giant step backwards by rescinding the common sense guidance that the Obama administration issued regarding this topic. Now, the guidance really just gives states tools to end the school-to-prison pipeline. And it also makes clear that policies that result in minority kids or disabled kids getting suspended or expelled at dramatically higher rates than white students or non-disabled students, for instance, that could violate civil rights laws, even if the policy itself doesn't appear discriminatory on its face. Now, when I met with Secretary DeVos prior to her nomination hearing, I brought up the importance of addressing pushout. And she seemed genuinely interested in making sure that every kid, even the ones who act out occasionally, get a chance at an education. Later, as mentioned, Senator Kaine and I sent a letter to her pleading to stick with the guidance. And then at the nomination hearing for Ken Marcus, her new Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, I pushed him to keep the guidance as well. And if you haven't already, I ask that you join in this fight. Because at that hearing, I presented Mr. Marcus with a damning hypothetical. I asked him whether it would be a civil rights violation for a school district to discipline black students at a rate 5 times higher than white students for the exact same violation of school policy. Marcus would not concede that this was actionable by the department. All he said was that it would warrant tough questions. Well, there is no satisfactory answer to any tough questions about why black students would be suspended at 5 times the rate of white students for the exact same misbehavior. That disparity is prima facie evidence of discrimination. There is no way that a school district can explain that away. And that's why the Obama guidance is necessary common sense. So listen, I've said this before, there is little reason for the federal government to be involved in the local education business other than civil rights. Right? That's why we got in to education policy in the first place, to guarantee that everybody gets a fair shot at a quality education. And this is a civil rights issue. I asked the Team Child Juvenile Justice Project in Connecticut to send me some of their representative cases of school pushout. And it's not a coincidence that almost every case that they sent involved a black student, a Hispanic student, or a student with a disability. This is who we are losing to this epidemic. And don't get me wrong, we are making great progress. The Obama administration guidance was great progress. We, through events like this and the work that CAP and those who will sit on the panel today are doing, are raising unprecedented awareness about this crisis. And more states and more school districts are stepping up and doing the right thing. In my state of Connecticut, several school districts made the courageous decision to take their school resource officers and move them outside of the school so that they would be there to respond to a public safety emergency, but they wouldn't be in the hallways policing misbehavior, which often ends up in kids getting arrested for behaviors that used to be taken care of by teachers and educators. So good things are happening. And if the guidance stays in place, more good things will happen with respect to reform of school discipline policies. But the Department of Education and the new head of the Office of Civil Rights might be about to take an unfortunate moral leap backward for this country. And that's why your willingness to join this fight and CAP's willingness, along with their partners, to convene this meeting today and this forum today couldn't come at a better time. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, delighted to join with you all in this work, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thank you very much.
Senator Murphy has an incredibly busy schedule. There are so many things going on, but
there are a couple things going on this week.
Just a couple things going on. I have like a ton of questions. I want to know what he thinks the motives are of this secretary and this administration for contemplating rescinding the guidance, but I'm going to hold my questions. We have a packed house here and turn it over to you all for a couple of questions for the senator. If you'd raise your hand, my colleague Antoine will walk a microphone back to you and you can state your name and affiliation and then ask a question. That would be fantastic. Got a question right over here.
Luann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. Thank you, Senator, for all your advocacy. My question is, are school districts or states actually using the school to prison pipeline as part of their ESSA plans? Have you noticed, or have you seen that a number of them are doing that?
They are. It doesn't get it doesn't get maybe as specific as tying school-based arrests to school measurement, but schools are required under ESSA to have a fifth factor, to have a factor that is not test scores or graduation rates, and so there are schools, and I'm sure you'll hear about it on this panel, who are using school climate measurements as part of their evaluation. And one of the ways in which you judge school climate, or a myriad of ways in which you can judge school climate, but one of them is school push out and discipline rates. I wish more states were doing this because, again, the overwhelming data tells us that it is climate, right? It is what students think about their school that has as much of a contributory factor to the success of that school as anything else. And what we know is that when students are made to feel other than the school, when they are made to feel as if their struggles push them out of the mainstream, it affects the entire climate. So yes, there are states that are building this into their plans. One of the worries we have is that we've done a lot of research on this. There's a lot of good data for schools to look at as they're trying to build an evaluation of school climate. Interestingly, the template that Secretary DeVos has sent out to schools in order for them to develop their ESSA plans makes no mention of evidence-based methodologies. And so we want school climate to be measured, but we want it to be measured in the ways that we know works.
Good morning. My name is Laura Gvarder. I'm with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights conducting research on this very subject, and we held a briefing about a month ago about this. And one of the objections that we kept hearing over and over were teachers who were saying that they felt that the policies that were designed to limit suspensions or discourage them actually ended up taking away teachers' ability to control their classroom and promoted a sense of unsafety among teachers. So I was sort of wondering how you would respond to that and how maybe we can take teacher control and classroom climate into account when talking about limiting the overuse of suspensions.
Sure. So I think there's a couple answers to that, and listen, I won't claim to be a practitioner, right? So I think it's probably not super helpful for Congress to be telling schools how to control classrooms. That's something that educators and administrators should be working on. But from what I understand and what I know through the work that Kathy does, is that one. Again, it's important to remember that the vast majority of suspensions are not connected to issues that are connected to the safety of students. That these are, kids skipping class or talking back or using foul language. These are not, what we would consider safety issues. And second, discipline is a pretty miserable way to manage a classroom, especially when kids respond much better to incentives for good behavior than they do to disincentives for bad behaviors. And so what we have to do is work with teachers and schools to give them a different set of tools to manage their classroom. Yes, absolutely, there are going to be behaviors that need to be met with discipline, right? No one is saying that you shouldn't use discipline when the moment is right or when the behavior is serious enough. But if you build positive school climates and if you invest in models like PBIS that are spending just as much time rewarding students who meet expectations as you are punishing students who don't meet expectations, you will all of a sudden find that you don't need discipline as much. We have this. I want to be careful about making this this leap, but in In Connecticut, we made a big mistake years ago, and we built a juvenile incarceration center for kids that looked exactly like an adult prison, we treated the kids like prisoners, and they acted like prisoners. They acted like the delinquents that they were labeled as. And as soon as we changed the model and changed the space to treat them like kids, and to provide them incentives for doing good things instead of just a ball and chain for doing bad things, the behavior changed automatically. Kids respond to the incentives you set for them, and schools and teachers just need to be given a different way of dealing with classrooms other than simple punitive measures.
Got time for one more question. Let's go in the back here. And I know these are issues that our panel is going to really dig into, which is just terrific.
Thank you. Good morning. Sean Griffin, Collaborative Communications. One of, and Senator Murphy, you kind of alluded to this in your description of the one student. A big issue here that hasn't come up yet is student mental health and how that plays into these challenges and the large number of suspensions, because there just aren't services within the schools to deal with some of the significant mental health issues that students are coming. They're the first programs to be cut. How has that played out in Connecticut, and what are your thoughts there?
Well, I don't think it's played out in Connecticut much better than it's played out in other parts of the country. We have just a patchwork in Connecticut. You can walk into one school in Connecticut and find a mental health clinic, and then you can walk into another school and find zero resources, one school counselor for the entire elementary school. So it's catch or catch can in Connecticut. Again, the hope is that by really mandating that schools build more holistic measurements of what is a good school, you'll provide incentives for those supports to be included. And then I think the challenge is really to policymakers to understand the true cost of not dealing with a child's trauma or a child's mental illness or a child's learning disability. We call it the school to prison pipeline because that is what's happening. Right? Kids are being pushed out of school or being arrested in school and are ending up in our juvenile justice system and then are ending up in our adult justice system. And I can guarantee you that the small investment that you make in a child's mental health well-being, the small investment you make in addressing their disability or their trauma pales in comparison to the amount of money that you're going to spend locking that kid up or cycling that kid or adult through the justice system later in life. Now, that shouldn't be the reason that you do it. The reason you should do it is because it's the right thing for that kid. But there is also an important financial consideration here that we miss. And again, this is an opportunity to build some bridges with Republicans, and akin to what has happened on the broader criminal justice reform initiative, because there is money to be saved here. I will just make one last comment. We were talking about this in the back room just to connect this conversation to what we're going to be talking about over the next 24 to 48 hours. Remember, we have DACA kids spread out all across this country in every conceivable classroom. And remember what happens to an undocumented child when they get caught in the school to prison pipeline, right? You think it's bad enough as a 15 or 16-year-old finding yourself arrested. Imagine what happens if you are in that position and you are undocumented. It's not just a couple weeks in detention or lockup. It may be that your entire life is rearranged. And so I think the reason that this issue of school discipline has started to attract more and more voices and more advocates is folks realize how broad the ramifications are. But there is a very direct connection between the subject that we are working on right now and the important work that we're and you are doing on the issue of trying to build better and more positive school climates. So I'm off to the Capitol to do that work of trying to rescue a generation of immigrant children, and I look forward to hearing about what the product of your work here is today. So thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. Before I introduce the panelists and we get started, just a big thank you for the Center for American Progress for hosting us. We're excited to be having this conversation here. And a huge thank you to Senator Murphy. I think it is awesome that he shared both the startling statistics on this issue and also the personal stories of students who are affected by it. And it's pretty rare to have a senator sort of cite positive behavior intervention systems like PBIS, and I think that speaks to his fluency of this issue. So thank you, Senator Murphy, for being a fierce advocate for this issue and for all of the students in our public schools. My name is Evan Stone. I am the co-founder and co-CEO at Educators for Excellence, which is a growing movement of teachers who are driving policy change from their classrooms up. It started in my classroom at PS 86 in the Bronx, along with my co-founder, Sydney Morris. We are now a movement of about 30,000 teachers across the country who are advocating on a whole host of issues. But why I'm here today is because over the last 3 years, every single one of the E3 chapters, all 6 of them across the country, have taken on this issue of school discipline, of trauma-informed teaching, of exclusionary practices in school discipline, because it is a pressing issue facing their schools and their communities, and because they know it is critical to increasing equity and excellence in their buildings. We're also here because last month our organization launched the campaign In Class Not Cuffs in response to the potential of rescinding this 2014 discipline guidance that the senator talked about. We came to DC to both testify in front of the Commission on Civil Rights and to meet with the Department of Education and introduce them to a whole host of teachers who are passionately working to shift the practices in their building, to shift their own practices, to address their own biases, to acknowledge the systemic racism that plays into this issue. And it was really exciting to see the department begin to engage with a broader cross-section of educators around this issue. And so today I'm hoping to continue that conversation here. And we're lucky to have such an amazing group of practitioners and experts and policy leaders. So I will do quick introductions, but then we're going to dive into the conversation because we have limited time. So sitting next to me is Bryn Elliott, who's the Chief of Equity at DC Public Schools. Next to her is Brittany Packnett, who's the Vice President of National Community Alliances at Teach for America. I should get that right as an alumni. Next to her is Abigail Gray, who's the Senior Researcher at the Consortium for Policy Research and Education Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. And next to her is Scott Pearson, the Executive Director of DC Public Charter School Board. 2 logistical items. If you're on Twitter, we're using the hashtag InClassNotCuffs, and also this panel is being live streamed on the CAP website. So if you tweet that out, maybe we'll get more people to participate in this conversation. So to begin, I sort of want to frame this issue in the broader conversation that Senator Murphy started. And Brittany, in addition to being your role at TFA, you're also a fierce advocate for racial equity and social justice. Can you help us connect this issue of exclusionary practices in school discipline to the broader movements going on across the country around racial equity?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me and for having not only this conversation, but leading alongside your teachers and the students that they serve every day on this. And thank you all for being here, for tuning in. So I will never forget August 10th, 2014, which was the first day that I stepped out onto the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, about 15 minutes from my home, to protest the killing of Michael Brown Jr., who was a student at a school where we placed Teach for America core members. At the time, I was running Teach for America in St. Louis. We had 20,000 students that we were serving all across the region, both in St. Louis County and in St. Louis City. And to know that had Michael Brown lived, we still had fundamentally failed him in so many ways haunted me. Also to know that his diploma that he worked so hard to get, and if you remember that video of his mother talking about how much and how much she put into getting him across that stage. To know that that diploma was not bulletproof also haunted me. So I stepped out there alongside thousands of other people, including many of our students and alums who on our personal time decided that we were not going to sit idly by while this was happening in our community, and began to do two things. One was to, as a pastor friend of mine likes to say, pray with our feet and actually show up in the spaces and the gaps where we talk so often about, but we don't remember to always be present in. And two, we wanted to be intentional about amplifying young people's voices. So the hashtag Don't Shoot was already starting to be very popular. And so a number of us were going around and recording students and their parents and saying, asking them to tell people why not to shoot. Right? So I want to be a doctor, don't shoot. Like, I want to graduate, don't shoot. I have dreams and hopes and aspirations, don't shoot. And in that moment and throughout this movement, we have been committed fundamentally to every person's ability to live their full life. Period, end of story. Whether that full life has the potential to be ended by the criminal justice system, by police violence, by violence in schools, right, and trauma in schools, it doesn't matter the means. We are committed very simply to people being able to live their full lives. And I'm reminded of a phrase that Ta-Nehisi Coates used in his first book, Between the World and Me, when he talks about his experience in school. And he asks, was the purpose of school to promote my curiosity or my compliance? Too often, certain kids get the opportunity to be curious children, to ask questions, to explore, to do the very thing that you are supposed to do in education as you develop who you are and develop your understanding of the world. And too often, other kids are only allowed to be compliant. And we know exactly which children we're talking about. The low-income children fit into the latter bracket. The wealthy children fit into the former bracket. Children of color fit into the latter bracket. White children fit into the former bracket. Disabled children fit into the latter bracket. Temporarily able-bodied children and able-minded children fit into the former bracket. And so in the greater context of the movements for racial and social justice that are happening right now, we are deeply concerned with the pipeline that leads not just from schools to prisons, but cradles to prisons, and the many stories and lives and families that are caught there in between. Because at the end of the day, our schools should be functioning as a place that empower young people in their curiosity and not push them into compliance status that leads them to a life that is not fully their own.
Thank you. Abigail, I'd love to hear from you, now that we've sort of centered this in the broader conversations around racial and social justice. What does this look like across the country? Senator Murphy told us a few of the statistics, but how is this playing out across racial lines, gender lines? Help us understand what this problem looks like.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, thank you. I'll join Brittany in thanking Center for American Progress for hosting us and everyone for attending this event. I think it's important to start off by thinking about how we got here. Schools, and I think along with this comes a real interest in making sure that we are not demonizing schools and school districts in this discussion, because really this derives from compliance. So the zero tolerance policies that we're talking about here today are rooted in the 1994 legislation about reducing guns in schools, essentially. So it was designed to promote the safety of students in schools, and that legislation led to the use of these zero tolerance policies, in which schools were really mandated to use harsh punishment and to respond to certain kinds of behaviors with either suspension or expulsion, exclusionary disciplinary practices, as we call them. So we now have, this is 25 years almost, so we now have a generation of teachers and administrators who were instructed that that was the way that they should respond to particular types of student behavior. And that became very pervasive, particularly, as you mentioned, in urban schools or in large districts where where we see these particularly alarming rates of disproportionality. So the disproportionality issue was covered, I think, in the 2 opening remarks. However, that is one of the key sort of pieces of this story. Other key pieces of the story, the research tells us that, that suspending students is not an effective intervention. So students who are suspended do not change their behavior. It does not work. Additionally, the research certainly substantiates the comments from the 2 initial speakers regarding the disproportionality and the fact that black student suspension rate is 3 times that of white students, that this begins in preschool. So students are being suspended disproportionate rates from the very beginning, the very earliest days of school. Additionally, we know now that suspension is directly correlated with basically every negative outcome you can imagine. So certainly involvement in the criminal justice system, as we've already talked about, but also poor academic achievement, retention in grade, low socioeconomic, or rather low socio-emotional outcomes. It does not serve students well, all of the research indicates. And then finally, I think I would also really emphasize that as we're kind of coming to this moment where we're beginning to reflect on these learnings about what suspension does and does not accomplish, that as Senator Murphy mentioned, we also know that there are more effective ways to manage discipline. PBIS is one prominent example that has a nice evidence base behind it. But there are different ways to manage discipline that will be effective for the vast majority of students. So those are some of the key things that come to mind in terms of thinking about the context for this.
Great. So it has terrible effects, it doesn't work, and it disproportionately affects our students of color. So this is a major problem that we're facing, and I want to turn to talk a little bit about some of the bright spots because we are seeing some things begin to work. So Bryn, I would love for you to tell us a little bit around what are you seeing at the system level, at DCPS, or at any of the other systems that you've worked on that's working? What are you putting in place that's helping to change this conversation?
All right. So good morning, and again, thank you for the opportunity. I would say I've had the privilege of working in 4 school districts, so Nashville Public Schools in Nashville, Tennessee, 2 school districts in North Carolina, and now in DC Public Schools. I've been a teacher, a middle school principal, a high school principal, and now in central office. So I've been in public education for about 25 years. Actually, I think I started in 1994, whenever No Child Left Behind started. So I've lived through that whole era and the issues around zero tolerance policies and those things. So I think I bring some diverse perspectives from the different positions that I have been able to have the privilege of working in. Some of the things that I've seen work over my lifetime of experience, and I'll start probably about 10 years ago, leading discipline work in Guilford County in North Carolina. We actually led an African American male initiative where we focused on a cohort of schools that were focused on reducing lost instructional time. And it's important to make that distinction because oftentimes people focus on just reducing suspensions, but if you can get your teachers and staff to buy into the fact that what you're trying to do is to increase the amount of time that students spend in school, therefore their opportunities to learn, that helps us to ensure that we meet our goals around academic progress. So we focused on an elementary, a middle, and a high school just to try to, as a pilot, to find out what would work and what would be scalable. We found some of the key things were to really focus on cultural proficiency training for teachers. So we did institutes with teachers. We assigned equity coaches to the schools to help support the students, support the schools in examining their discipline data. I also did this work in Wake County with a similar pilot. These were middle schools that had suspension rates that were more than double the district average. We actually, looking at our data in Wake County, 180 schools, found that there were about 30 schools that accounted for almost 50% of the suspension. So it's typically not all schools that have those huge problems, but really trying to figure out where do you really focus, and then what the strategies are. In that work, we also did work around equity teams and how to really build a team's capacity to address their data from the lens of implicit bias. So we provided lots of training for the team. One of the things that worked really well there is that one of our middle schools in the pilot, every suspension, the leadership team gathered together to make a decision around the suspension. So they would look at their data to see if the student that they were making a suspension decision around was a student of color, they would look to see if there were other situations where white students were disciplined for the same offense, and if so, what was the consequence? And they would ensure that the consequence that was given to the student of color was the same consequence. So really trying to get down to the, dig down really deeply to individual kids and look at the consequences that they received. In the work in Wake County, we were actually under an OCR inquiry because of the disproportionality in our suspensions. So we actually took the discipline guidance that was provided and build a comprehensive plan for equitable discipline practices based on the 3 guiding principles out of that guidance. So I think that was really helpful to be really intentional about what your strategies are and making sure that you have strategies in all 3 areas, which are climate, supports to students, and equity. And finally, I would say in DC public schools, over the years, there's been some significant reductions in suspensions. What has worked here is really a focus on restorative practices. And so how do we not look at, as when we're dealing with a behavior consequence, not just focus on discipline. When you just discipline kids, you basically are teaching them what not to get caught doing. So how do we really take more of an instructional approach to discipline, to a behavior consequence? So we work through scenarios with students. What are different ways to behave, and how do we help students to be able to be self-aware and have self-management skills? And so some of that's around our new work in DC public schools around social emotional learning.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all the different levels of seeing those supports in place. And on the restorative practices, another place where we're seeing this really work is there's a new pilot in New York City in District 18 where we've seen over an 18-month implementation of restorative justice program, a 25% reduction in out-of-school time for students, and also significant improvements in student achievement tied to that. So I think we're seeing it across the country. Scott, I'd love to bring you in. We heard a little bit from Abigail around how some of this started with compliance, a top-down compliance, and you've been a fierce advocate for the autonomy of the charter network. But often the charter network is criticized for having some higher rates of suspensions in their schools. So how do you think about the balance between the autonomy that is necessary in the charter sector and the ensuring that we have equity and transparency around discipline in the schools?
Yeah, thank you. So just a little context. I run the DC Public Charter School Board, which is the sole charter school authorizer in Washington, DC. We oversee 120 schools serving about 42,000 students, which account for a little less than half of the total public student population in the district. So when I took over this job 6 years ago, we knew we had an issue for all the reasons that everyone on this panel has said, but also some unique issues for charter schools, which is that this was a rap against charter schools, and our agency firmly believes that charter schools are public schools, and so they need to act like public schools and serve all students. So that added to sort of the imperative to do something, but at the same time, as you mentioned, we have a real belief that each one of these schools are autonomous, that is a source of their strength and their quality, that it was not our role to create top-down mandates, and that we wanted a change to come about in authentic ways for each school because each school was unique. And we knew that a lot of the changes that we've heard about, whether it's PBIS or trauma-informed, doesn't just happen overnight. It requires training and work with teachers. So all that was important. And so as we thought about our strategy, we took all that into account. And the approach that we developed really focused on data and focused on a theory of change that believed that the board of each school and the executive director of each school would act differently if they had data and if data was used in different ways. So the first thing we did, at that time we did not have good data on suspensions, but we did have expulsion data. First thing we did was we literally released it to the Washington Post, and they published the expulsion data school by school. This had never been released, and it showed that one of our schools expelled 6% of their students. Nobody knew this, and I got a lot of angry calls from school leaders saying, you're running down charter schools, you're hurting our schools, and we said no, far from the opposite. This is a movement that's about transparency, and we need to be open about what's happening. So that in itself resulted in changes because, as Bryn said, this is something where a smaller group of the schools are responsible for most of the discipline. They didn't like seeing their data published that way, and so they on their own brought about changes. But then we did a lot more. We augmented our data, we really improved the data collection, and got to the point where we were seeing suspensions real time. We'd have monthly meetings where we would look at the data and we would have our analysts look for evidence of disproportionality, because what we found was that suspension decisions were being made at the school level, but often the school's executive director had no idea how many students were being suspended, and they certainly didn't know that their special ed students were being suspended at 2.6 times the rate of their gen ed students, because nobody was doing that analysis. And the boards didn't know either. And so we started doing this analysis month by month and letting schools know whether they were outliers. Charter schools are very competitive. They want to know how they compare with other schools. So we'd show, you're suspending more than the average, less than the average by grade band. And so providing that information really empowered school leaders to make changes. We also, in some cases, the changes weren't happening or the issues were really egregious. So we would bring the boards in for what we called board-to-board meetings and have really frank discussions about this and made sure that the boards themselves were focused on this issue. We created an audit policy that said, if we're seeing evidence of disproportionality, we will go into the school, audit their suspensions and their other activities, and see whether the disproportionate data was an evidence of disproportionate implementation or applying rules in different ways. We created with our partners across the city something called equity reports. So years before ESSA, we publish suspension data school by school, broken out by subgroup and compared with city averages. So it's all out there for people to see. We audited school discipline policies to make sure that due process and that all of the requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Act were incorporated in there. We brought experts from around the country to do professional development with our schools, and then we advocated for more resources for our schools so that they could make these changes that were so important. So we did a lot, but without ever telling a school, you can't suspend or you can't expel. And the results have been really heartening. Expulsions have gone from over 1% of students to 0.2% of students. So that's about the national average. Suspensions have fallen from 14% to last year 9% of students, and this year we're seeing data that's indicating that that's going to fall by about another third. So we're still not all the way there. We still have a ways to go, but really pleased with the progress we've made and the fact that we've been able to do it in a way that's respectful of the charter school model.
Yeah, that data is really exciting, and the transparency is also really admirable because I think it gives everybody a line of sight into what's happening. Is there a school or something that you're hearing back from boards or from principals or executive directors around what's working at the school level?
So as you'd expect in something as diverse as the charter schools, there's lots of different ways that they're going about this. Some, frankly, are creating in-school suspension rooms, and they're going from out-of-school suspension to in-school suspensions. Others are really embracing trauma-informed work. They're training all of their teachers. They're really leading with love at the schools, and it's really heartening to see the change. We had a meeting with the school yesterday that has struggled to bring its rates down and has said, and came to us with a proposal to change their classroom size from 32 to 24, and had other changes that would allow them to pay for that because they really believe that would be something that would make a difference. We have one school that serves about 1,100 students and has now employs 10 mental health professionals to work with those students because that's been their approach to addressing these issues. So lots of different ways, but many paths to the same outcome.
Great. We have one thing that makes me think about is we have these teams of teachers in Minnesota that have developed a guide to go bottoms up at the school level to change discipline. And in that guide, the first step is to say, what is the data in our building? Let's disaggregate it. Let's look at it. Let's really understand the problem. And one of the challenges that we see across the country is that data is hard to find and hard to get your hands on and hard to understand. So it's great how transparent you're making that. But you did talk a little bit around how at DC Charter Network, you have not put in sort of top-down policies. We have seen some districts and some states begin to do that. Abigail, you've studied Philadelphia pretty closely. They're a district that has tried to restrict the use of out-of-school suspensions for some of the lower-level infractions that Senator Murphy talked a little bit about. Can you tell us how that's working, what's happened, what have some of the good things or maybe some of the negative implications of that been?
Yes, so there has been in about half of the districts in the country, or about a quarter of the districts in the country rather, have started to recognize these patterns of disproportionality and to think about instituting policies that would restrict the use of suspension and kind of backing away from the zero tolerance approach. And Philadelphia is one of those. So in the wake of really alarming research about disproportionality, about the harms of suspension, in 2012 and 13, the School District of Philadelphia revised its Code of Student Conduct, and it essentially it prohibited the use of suspension in response to nonviolent offenses like disruption of class and the use of profanity. So this was a big change because that was a lot of suspensions. There were a lot of students being suspended previously for those reasons. And at the same time, the School District of Philadelphia made an investment, began phasing in an investment in PBIS. So now they're up to about 40 or 50 schools that receive funds from centralized funds from the district through various grant funding sources to train and implement PBIS in those schools. In addition, they've invested in trauma training for staff, as you mentioned, and restorative practices in some of the schools. So they are working to both come at it from a policy level and also from a programming level. So my team recently completed a large study of disciplinary practices in Philadelphia in the wake of these changes. And what we found essentially is that most schools, at least at the administration level, are recognizing the need to move away from suspension as a primary response to misbehavior, and that most schools are attempting to do so. And we conducted an analysis in which we were able to identify 3 types or profiles of schools in Philadelphia. We focused on K through 5 and K through 8 schools because in Philadelphia, actually, students are suspended at a higher rate in elementary schools than in high schools. And that is not just Philadelphia, that's many districts. And so we focused on K through 8 students, and we were able to identify 3 profiles of schools based on their disciplinary practices and their climate. And what we found essentially is that those schools, and it was nearly a third of them, that have a more collaborative and relational climate. In other words, these are schools where there's higher staff morale, where there's lower use of punitive and exclusionary disciplinary practices, where their staff reports skepticism about the effectiveness of suspension. We found that in those schools, students had a significantly lower suspension rate and significantly higher achievement based on their state test scores in math, science, and English language arts. So we see that there are examples of schools with this kind of climate, and that was controlling, by the way, for demographic factors. we see that there are, in Philadelphia, there are schools where there are big changes happening and where these kinds of more restorative PBIS type practices are taking hold. However, we also saw that the schools that have received the funding and the investment in the PBIS from the district are in all three of the profiles that we identified. So what this tells us, and the qualitative research that we did along with us tells us, is that there's a lot of potential here, and schools need a lot of help getting there, particularly the schools that are serving the most challenged students. They are struggling in many cases to implement the kinds of programming that we know can be effective in creating a more positive type of climate and reducing suspension. There was another study that came out of Philadelphia just a month after our study was published, and that was by my colleague Matthew Steinberg and Johanna Lecoe from Mathematical Policy Research Institute, and they found it was looking at a different period of time, asking very different kinds of questions, but they found similarly that in the schools that actually implemented the new policy to restrict the use of suspension, that there were no ill effects on students who had not previously been suspended, and that students who had previously been suspended, the policy shift was associated with decreased suspension, increased attendance, and slight increases in academic achievement. So again, the authors of that study point to this issue of implementation. In schools where we see these policies being implemented and well, we see signs of promise. We don't see that in all schools. There's really a big implementation challenge.
Right. And, one of the things I think we hear a lot is that it is about how do we actually support teachers to shift their practice and to change. And one of the places where that needs to start is in teacher preparation. But we also know it's not just about discipline. This is about being culturally responsive. This is about understanding how to do classroom management, that discipline is just one of the data points that we can look at to see when everything else in the building is failing. So Brittany, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about both when you were leading a region or what Teach for America is doing across the country to think about how do we prepare teachers to come into the classroom more aware and ready to support students.
I'm really appreciative of this question because you're absolutely right. Too often, this broader conversation weighs heavily on the back end of things, and it's absolutely necessary to talk about what you all are discussing. But the inputs matter a great deal, and I think you've spoken to the successes of some of these. So, at Teach for America, we paid attention to the outputs. For example, we were training our teachers in a particular theory of classroom management that we found to not be culturally responsive, and so we stopped training our teachers in it. It was pretty simple to do, actually. We didn't have to ask for people's permission. And so we stopped doing that, but we said, if we're going to stop doing that, what are the inputs that we actually have to make? So culturally responsive pedagogy has been really central to that because it forces us to ask a different question than we are asking right now in the school discipline conversation. Right now in the school discipline conversation, the ultimate question is how do we get kids to stop doing something, to your point? The question that culturally responsive pedagogy forces you to ask is, what is the purpose of education and how do we actually get there? The answer to that in culturally responsive pedagogy is based in three things. That yes, it is fundamentally about academic rigor, but it is also about cultural confidence, believing in who I am and seeing my full self as valuable and worthy and whole. And also critical consciousness, understanding the world around me, how it relates to me, how I relate to it, and how I take that confidence and the academic skills I've developed to change and develop the world as I believe it should be, right? And so because it shifts the question, it forces us to operate very differently. So across our 53 regions at Teach for America, we emphasize culturally responsive pedagogy, not just in our Summer Institute training, but throughout the continued development that our teachers get. We also are very intentional to recruit diverse teachers from around the country. We make sure to leverage our partnership with AmeriCorps such that people coming from low-income backgrounds and communities of color can actually afford to be teachers. And so when we are very intentional about recruiting diverse folks, for the last couple of years, at or over 50% of our teachers have been people of color, which is very different from the National Teaching Corps, which is overwhelmingly white. And it matters a great deal for the kind of relationship and role modeling that a teacher is able to do. Great teachers come from all backgrounds, but we know that there's the possibility and the potential for a profound additional impact when a teacher shares a racial or economic identity with their students. But identity isn't enough. And I say this because when we look at the research around Black children, we know that Black girls are seen as less innocent beginning at age 5, and Black boys are seen as more adult as children by all adults. Now, it happens to varying degrees across races, but it's happening across all adults. So there are narratives being told about children of color that all of us are internalizing and believing, and it is coming out in our practice. And we know from the research that E4E has done that teachers don't want to contribute to systemic racism. Teachers want to get this right, to your point. And so equipping them to do so means actually helping all teachers root out their racial bias, their socioeconomic bias, and we spend a lot of time doing that at Teach for America. We spend a lot of time talking about issues of safety and what that really means, right? When I'm talking, there was a question earlier about safety. There are layers underneath that, though, right? Because who are your students, and why are you thinking about, would you be thinking about safety issues the same way if your students were a different color, if they had a different nation of origin, if they spoke a different language, right? We have a number of undocumented students that we serve. We've got 200 documented teachers right now that we're fighting to protect, and the conversations that we're having with them and the conversations that we're having with all of our teachers is, how are you thinking about the safety and the protection of your undocumented students as you are thinking about your classroom management? Because if you are sending a child to a school resource officer who is afraid of an immigration officer coming to their door or the police violence that they've experienced in their neighborhood, that is doubly traumatizing that student. So then you're asking them to come back in after they've internalized that trauma and get right back to learning. It's not going to happen. So we really try in our preparation not only to emphasize culturally responsive pedagogy, not only to ensure that we have a diverse core of teachers, but to really help people examine their bias, their racial identity development, and understand who they are and the power that they wield in classrooms.
Great. That makes me continue to try to highlight places around the country where we see this great work happening, and that makes me think a lot about LAUSD, where a coalition of parents and students and teachers came together to pass the Students' Bill of Rights, which calls out a lot of the things that you just discussed of schools are meant to be this safe, welcoming, inclusive place where all kids can learn and feel safe. But we got to talk about this federal guidance, because that's part of the panel. And so I want to start with you, Bryn, because you talked a little bit about in North Carolina, you were in a district that was under an OCR investigation, and as a result of that, you created this comprehensive plan. I'd love to know, like, how is that helpful to the district, and what do you think some of the risks are to districts like ones that you've worked in if this guidance isn't in place and some of the pressure from the federal government isn't there?
So those are all good questions. So
there's a lot in there.
It was. So I think the guidance was extremely helpful. So, you know, so I was working in Guilford County, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina in 2014 when it came out. And at that point, our school district had as a strategic plan goal of reducing out-of-school suspensions and disparities between suspensions. And we really, I mean, we had a goal. We really didn't have really research-based strategies. And so I actually lucked upon the guidance by Googling, trying to figure out what was out there around suspensions, and found the guidance. And we were so excited to have those resources to be able to come up with a strategic plan to really address it. So to me, the guidance is still out there for schools and school districts that want to use it, with a number of different resources attached to it, including like a district level planning guide or school level planning guides and other resources. So I would hope those things would not be removed. What was the advantage, again, for me as a district leader, is that before we were kind of pulling at straws, like we were trying to create our own plan. And what that plan did was, that template for a plan was to provide you with all the strategies that there is evidence behind that works in resources that you can connect to based on the strategies that you selected. So our district in Wake County ended up with a plan with 68 steps, which is a lot of strategies. But you know, what we realized, there were just big buckets of things that, some things that the district had already done. So those were things that we could speak to. For instance, we were a PBIS district with 100 of the schools that had been PBIS schools. But when we examined our data, which we were not doing a good job until in 2015, we weren't doing a good job in examining data. Even in those PBIS schools, there were huge disproportionalities in the data. So the guide helped us to identify that as a strategy that we needed, which was and we were not, at that point, we had never been providing to our principals monthly reports with their discipline data disaggregated by ethnicity. So they had never seen the data in that way. And you know, sometimes people just don't know. Like you think you are making good decisions in a fair manner, but until that data is presented to you, where you can really see in your school that African American kids are being suspended twice more frequently for white students for the same offense, until you're really looking at that, it really kind of pushed people to action. So I guess the other thought that I would have around the guidance, it is guidance. It's like, it's not a law, it's not policy, it's just guidance. So I still think, you know, school districts have a lot of flexibility with what they do. What was my advantage in this is that I happen to work for 3 school districts, and I have colleagues in school districts all across the United States, that this is a priority issue for them, and particularly because of the connection between discipline and student achievement. Oftentimes your discipline gap is the other side of your achievement gap, like they're just the other side of the coin. So you see huge gaps in achievement when you disaggregate your data by race, with kids of color on the bottom. When you look at the other side of that being suspension, kids that are missing instructional time due to behavior, your African American children or students of color are more frequently. So I think it helped for the school districts that I've had the privilege of working with, and those that I have an opportunity to have colleagues in. We see addressing discipline as essential to improving your school achievement. And also, I think it's important around the climate work too. So, you know, we want all kids to feel safe and supported in a learning environment. That climate itself contributes to student learning. So if a student is always thinking that, you know, someone is looking at me as I'm going to do something wrong, then that student is going to be less likely to be really engaged in the classroom. So I think all of those things kind of fit together as this guidance continues to help us to get to the outcomes we want to around student achievement and having safe and supported classrooms for all students.
Great. So I want to open it up to questions to make sure that we can engage with the audience here. So I'll give everybody a chance for sort of final words. So the guidance is one component of this. We're going to keep fighting and playing defense on that front. But all these stories also give me real hope about what's happening across schools across the country. So if you could share just a little bit about what's next, either at the policy level, the practice level, the advocacy level, what are you focused on? And while they're doing that, start to think about your questions. We can go in any order.
Me to start. I mentioned one school that has 10 mental health professionals for a little over 1,000 students. That seems to be really important. And so a big focus of ours is to work, actually we're working in partnership with the chair of our City Council's Committee on Education, David Grasso, to try to increase city support for behavioral health specialists in schools. Right now, the city has behavioral health professionals in about 60 out of a total of 230 schools. And we think that that's directly related to, so many students are suspended because of behavioral health issues, you know, unresolved trauma issues, And in many cases, these are really serious, and a classroom teacher isn't necessarily equipped to work with that child in the way that he or she needs. So that's been a big focus of ours.
Great. Abigail?
I think, as I mentioned, the focus now should be, or a focus now should really be on this issue of implementation. I think all of what we've been talking about here plays into that. I think that we need to identify the barriers to highly challenged schools being able to implement evidence-based practices effectively. We know what can work to help change the climate of schools in ways that benefit all students and teachers. And we need to really prioritize and not allow ourselves to be distracted from the work of making that work in schools. And I think, so for instance, our team, we've recently received a grant from the National Institute of Justice to partner with the School District of Philadelphia and to implement some of the recommendations from the study that we recently completed. And the idea there is to provide really intensive resources to a small set of schools and to study the impact of that, of providing intensive teacher coaching around PBIS implementation, of providing trauma training for all of the staff, and coming at it from a perspective of like, we know this program can work, how do we make it work here?
Right.
So 2 quick things. At Teach for America, our executive leadership team spends a lot of time talking about the predictable future versus the alternative future. And in the predictable future, we know what will happen. We've talked at great lengths about what will happen if the status quo continues. Hey, Rhonda. Rhonda helps walk us through that framework at Teach for America. And but the alternative future will require us to position ourselves fundamentally differently than we've been doing now. Right now, and not just in the conversation about school discipline, but in the broader conversation about education reform, we tend to just shuffle around the chairs on the deck instead of actually realize that we can get off the boat and take a completely different route. And so we are committed to really imagining the alternative future. We are committed to leveraging the autonomy and the space that we have in partnership with our communities to really innovate in ways that are beyond kind of what we're thinking right now. And that is requiring us to get out of our silos, to remove ourselves from false dichotomies, to remove ourselves from the charter versus traditional conversation or the vouchers versus no voucher conversation, and actually root ourselves in what is the purpose of education, especially for marginalized young people. The other thing that I believe in terms of the direction that we all need to be taking is the person always missing from these conversations is parents. And we train our core members to really treat parents and guardians and any influencer that a child has as the experts on that child in addition to the child themselves. And I remember an alum principal of ours in St. Louis who actually wanted to get rid of all of the police officers at his school. And the most opposition he got from that was from parents. And my question to him was, what's the conversation that you had with parents about this, right? Did you just as an edict say, I'm the principal and I'm getting rid of the police officers? Or did you sit down and actually imagine the kind of school that you wanted to create in partnership with children and their parents and their influencers, and decide what the mechanics of that school would be? And when he went back and did it the other way, they started to make progress on that same goal. But I'm hopeful that as we continue this conversation, we can ensure that the parent voice is much more central.
So for DC Public Schools, I would say our focuses moving forward are around social emotional learning. So how do we help young people develop the skills that they need to be successful in life in school? So around self-awareness, self-confidence, social awareness, responsible decision making. So how do we build up those skills and teach those intentionally to our students, as well as how do we do that work with adults as well that are interacting with our students. Our second focus is around equity. So how do we, and I love that our chancellor says that one of the marks that he wants to leave on the city is his intentionality around addressing institutional biases that address and impact our students' education. So how do we really do that work well and help our students to build cultural proficiency and cultural confidence so that they are, providing an excellent classroom for every child, regardless of that child, where that child comes from. And then the third piece of our work is focused on trauma-informed practices. And so we too, have a lot of students that live in extreme poverty, and we understand the brain science around how that poverty influences students' ability to learn. So we want to ensure that we have the mental health resources and support the whole continuum, like what we do for every child, and additionally, what do we do for students who are struggling in the classroom. So how do we really build that continuum of mental health supports for our students?
Great, thank you. So let's turn and open it up for questions. Start right here in the front. And just state your name and your affiliation, please.
Hi, my name is Mahogany. I work at Upper Bound at GW. And my question is really around after-school care and programs that are trying to help students just get back up in their reading and math levels, as well as get them college ready. And my question is, what can we do when our students go to so many different schools, and then a lot of them are suspended or switch schools because of behavior issues? So how can we support them while getting them ready for college? So how do we get them to critically think and be socially aware of themselves, as well as learn how to filter and be compliant in some areas? What can we do when we have them for such a short period of time?
So our team in St. Louis did a book study, the whole team, not just our teacher coaches, but the entire team, did a book study on a book called The Art of Critical Pedagogy. It was written by Jeff Duncan Andrade, who's an alum of ours, and Ernest Morel. Jeff has a school that he runs out in Oakland. And what I love about that book is, A, it is incredibly practical, right? The application of culturally responsive pedagogy. And I would say that especially because of how much your students are forced to move around and experience all of these different things, the thing that they need to experience when it comes to you all is consistency. So if your whole team, again, not just the people who are working directly with students, but your whole team, actually spend time in a book like that, or Everyday Anti-Racism is another excellent practical one, and actually think about how to apply those practices in the amount of time that you have, the consistency that your young people will experience, the consistent revolutionary love, the consistent safe space, and the consistent rigor will help them succeed. So thanks for the work that you do.
I think we have a question in the back.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Max Trujillo. I'm a policy consultant here in Washington. I wanted to ask if there's data that explain, I would say, because I can't figure of a better concept to call it, non-traditional external factors that impact children's behavior. And I'm thinking, for example, and of course the discipline that the school may apply to the children. And I'm thinking, for example, the children that had to move from one district to another after Katrina. I'm thinking of the children of U.S. children of undocumented parents in certain schools. And if there is that data, how or can it be applied to the circumstances of the over 20,000 children that are moving from Puerto Rico to Florida, which English might certainly not be their first language, and certainly under duress? Thank you.
Anybody want to talk about trauma? Or?
Speak to that a little bit. I can't speak specifically to the issues that you mentioned in terms of student transience, for instance, but there is a significant body of literature on the impacts of trauma, as several other folks on the panel have mentioned, and we know that in Philadelphia, for instance, the vast majority of students have experienced some sort of personal or familial trauma, and I'm quite sure that a move, a life change of that kind of significance would fall under that umbrella. So yes, I think there is absolutely pertinence for this conversation to that issue. Absolutely.
And in DC, our state has analyzed suspension data every which way and has found that suspensions are higher for students who have moved between schools than for students who are stable in schools.
I would say to the students who are coming to the States from Puerto Rico, we've seen some districts around the country begin to think about, how do we create a space that is welcoming, knowing that they've probably experienced some pretty significant trauma. And I was just talking to some of the leadership in Boston Public Schools, and they're doing some really incredible work. So in looking for bright spots on districts that are thinking about how do we create a space where students who are coming in who might have just lost at least almost everything material, how do we welcome them in a way that helps address some of that trauma, because it can be addressed, and trauma-informed practice, which many people have talked about, is a piece of that. Any other questions? Here in the third row on the right.
Hi, thank you to the panel. My name is Barbara. I work for the Learning Policy Institute. They're based in California, but they've been here for a couple years now in DC. I had a question about some of the recent work that has been published from the UCLA Civil Rights Project about linking suspension rates, higher suspension rates, with charter schools nationwide, not specific to DC. They did publish just last month a report on DC and actually commending them for desegregating their schools at large. However, it seems to be that it's a lower rate, or it's at a lower rate in charter schools versus traditional public schools. So if maybe you could talk a little bit about that. As a researcher, I think data is one of the major solutions to get around this, being able to streamline the data, because I think this study in particular looked at the National Center of Education Statistics, which limits some of the findings that I think, as you mentioned, has been published already to the Washington Post. Thank you.
You want to talk about potential reasons maybe why there are higher rates of suspension in the charter sector?
So it's been interesting in DC because as our rates have been coming down, so have DCPS's, and we're sort of chasing them down, but every year they're just a little lower than we are. So.
That's healthy competition.
Exactly. Exactly. I can't speak to the national data. I do know that there has been a movement in the past of charter schools that market themselves as no excuses schools. It's interesting, many of those are now backing away from that definition. That's not the brand they want, and that's not the approach they're taking, but they still feel like they're still viewed that way. But it came from a sincere belief that students, particularly low-income students, would achieve higher academic results and have better life outcomes if they were in a school where there was a tremendous amount of order and where there were few distractions from the learning environment. I think they're now 10, 20 years into this and have learned from that, and you see a lot of changes, but it could still be that we are seeing a legacy of that pedagogical approach from the last decade.
Anybody else add to that? Great. Maybe one final question. I'm sort of getting the... We'll do it. One final question in the back. Microphone's coming.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your work. My name is Imani Wiltshire, and I'm a first-year doctoral student in counseling psychology at Howard University. And Brittany, this question is geared towards something that you mentioned earlier about cultural competence training. And I'm curious about how you measure the success of teachers that undergo that type of training and what it looks like. And also, is that training ongoing, or is it something that they are met with at the initial orientation process? And could it be transferable to other schools?
So I know that you mentioned it as well, so I want to invite you to, you got, my goodness, so many years in the game. I'm thankful for you. I will tell you from our perspective, to answer your last question first, it is ongoing. And I specify culturally responsive pedagogy because it is actually the theory and practice of teaching, right? So I think sometimes people can conflate cultural compliance training, which is people envision kind of a sensitivity training, right? And here's how you understand different cultures. What we're talking about is an entire system of teaching that informs every single practice, from the literature that you're using to the ways in which you are checking for understanding from your students, to the ways in which you are managing through instruction on the front end and not discipline on the back end, to how you're walking through the hall and probably not walking around with bubbles in your mouth, because second graders like to talk, and so maybe you whisper instead of have a bubble in your mouth. So there are ways in which we help our teachers apply that in a broader framework of that pedagogical understanding, though. And it is highly applicable. It is not at all something that we created, right? Gloria Ladson-Billings is the architect of culturally responsive pedagogy. She is still an active professorship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we continue to learn from her and lots of people who have been applying her practice in different spaces. So yeah, I mean, we have consulted and learned from the experts on this, both in practice and in theory, to apply this. So if it's applicable to us, it's certainly applicable for everyone.
Yeah, so I guess what I would add, we're certainly just starting this work. I'm 10 weeks on the job in DC public schools as their first equity officer that they've had. But we have, so currently we have a structure for doing professional development, which is called LEAP. And our plan is to, first of all, really start with helping to build people's knowledge around the history of racism in America, building their cultural proficiency, understanding race, how it impacts all systems and structures in our country, but then building on the pedagogical practices for our teachers through our LEAP process. So those are some of the key plans that we have. The other thing that we're really focused on is how do we really help young people to build their scholar identity. Sometimes kids of color do not see themselves showing up as scholars in the classroom, and that impacts a lot of things that we see, not just academic performance, but whether those students pursue access to honors classes or to AP classes, and where they end up in college and those type of things. So one of the key things we want to focus on is our young people, to increase our programming and support for students of color, and to see how we really help them help to build their scholar identity, while at the same time we work on the adult behaviors of why teachers or our leaders may not see young people of color as scholars in their school building. So I think for us, it's addressing both parts of those equations.
And just as a really quick resource, there's a very simple, like 5 or 6 page academic article from Dr. Ladson-Billings called "But That's Just Good Teaching: The Case for Culturally Responsive Pedagogy." And I have handed that article out so many times because for some reason, as soon as people hear the word culture or culturally responsive, they presume some kind of leftist agenda that actually is not embodied in this pedagogy at all. It is actually just about good teaching, which is what all of this comes down to, good teaching. So if that's a helpful resource, definitely look that up.
Great, so we need to wrap there. So a huge thank you to all of our panelists for your brilliant work. Thank you to Center for American Progress and to Senator Murphy for kicking us off, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you.